Hi there, my name is Janie Nicoll and I'm the current President of Scottish Artists Union. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming along this evening, and thanks also to the candidates and everyone who's helped out and to Out of the Blue for allowing us to host this event here tonight. I'm just going to read a wee bit out of an introduction about Scottish Artists Union, because I think quite a lot of people don't really know what we do. So anyway, Scottish Artists Union is the foremost campaigning organisation for visual and applied artists and makers working in Scotland, currently representing almost 1,400 professional artists. We've been working in conjunction with other arts organisations such as the New Artists Union England, Iain, which is Artists Information and Representation. That's a nationally based organisation. Applied Arts Scotland, and amongst others, and we're in the process of affiliating to the GFTU, which is the General Federation of Trade Unions. We're an autonomous organisation with no funding other than from our own membership fees, and we're politically neutral. However, we feel that our role is to help inform our membership, and this kind of event is an important way of doing this. We're documenting the event tonight for our website, which is www.sau.org.uk, and there will be live tweeting of the event from Ailey Rutherford, I'm not sure where he is, and Peter van der Weer. We've also got, if anyone else wants to tweet, that's our tweet address at Scottish Artists Union, and we're using the hashtag SAU Hustings. We've recently introduced a new leaflet which is on your seats, which is aimed at artists, reminding them of their rights, and aimed at organisations, reminding them of their obligations. And we've also got memberships forms at the desk over there if anyone would like to take one and think about maybe joining, or if they know artists who might like to become members. Most artists work individually or in a fairly singular way, and we believe it's vitally important for artists to work together and to have a collective voice. As we move towards the Scottish Parliamentary elections, we feel strongly that the cultural sector is a key area that needs protecting, nurturing and promoting both now and for the future. We believe that it's important to support and promote a strong, secure cultural sector with its links to Scotland's international reputation through creative innovation, benefits to tourism and the potential for the development of the wider economy in general. Despite what may appear to be a thriving cultural sector, however, we are concerned that at the precarious nature of the arts ecology, with most artists experiencing declining working standards, increasingly struggling to survive in a sector that is dominated by mainly self-employed individuals. From our membership survey, we know that 78% of our membership are currently self-employed. Many are on top-up benefits, and we're particularly worried about new rules to claiming these benefits through universal credit, which is currently being rolled out, and new stipulations that to be eligible for self-employed top-up benefits, there's a need to be profitably self-employed. We see this as being at odds with creativity and the development of ideas. We're worried about parts of the sector that are being squeezed, that are currently experiencing what you might call a double dunt. They're being squeezed by direct funding cuts to the arts and culture budget at a national level, as well as cuts to local authorities and arts initiatives which have long been a source of income for many artists, and are inevitably the first thing to be cut from council budgets. We believe that public investment in the arts should promote equality and diversity, and this should mean fair play for everyone, including artists. More practically, the pressure on artists to work for unrealistically low remuneration and even to work for nothing, with an increase in the emphasis on volunteering and internships, can cause many talented artists to leave the sector, give up entirely, or move abroad. The implications of this are likely to cause the erosion of Scotland's cultural economy and the vitally important grassroots sectors, which can only be detrimental to the future economy of Scotland. I could go on about all these things, but I'll not drag on because the time is short. But if you'd like to check out our website, Or I also gave a presentation at the Cross-Party Group for Culture, which is on the website they have, which talks more about these issues, and that's at cpgonculture.com. And the event was called The Artist as an Endangered Species. Anyway, I won't blab on any longer, just to say that the format of this event will be short presentations by the political representatives, some questions from the SAU membership. There's 4 artists who are going to ask questions, and then it'll be open to the floor. And I'm very pleased to welcome Jim Tuff, who's the director of the Saltire Society, who's going to take over from me and host this evening. So anyway, thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks very much to all the candidates for coming.
Thanks very much for coming along here at the Blue. It's a great venue, and Rob, who's one of the directors here, can tell you all about it if you want a chance. And I think Rob was telling me that the demand for places for artists to be able to come and work here far outseas the available spaces. Another thing about the Blue is it's very much part of this community, and so an exceptional place that deserves a plug. So there it is. Because this event's been instigated by the Scottish Artists Union, it seems only right to set the scene and part with the words of an artist. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from an artist, some of you will know, Rachel McLean. She's part of the British Art Show currently, makes fantastic films. And she said, as part of her evidence to Creative Scotland's review of the visual arts, she said, I can think of very few instances in the last 7 years in Scotland where the fee for the show or commission has paid me at least minimum wage for my time. The majority of what I have done has been for vastly below minimum wage. So that's chimes with what Janie was saying earlier. And I've often heard it said from a political point of view that there are no votes on the doorstep, that hunting the arts not does they necessarily secure political support. I think I personally would beg to differ, and maybe the panel would too. Our creative lives from when we're weans to when we're elderly, I believe, touching our health, wealth and well-being as individuals and as a community. And again, Rachel McLean has some wise words in that vein. In our culture, the visual is not an add-on extra, a give-or-take thing that we could easily live without. It's essential to understanding our world and communicating with one another. So we're delighted. I think we were supposed to have 7, we've lost one of the candidates, one of the speakers. And there's some confusion about the end of the names. So we have 6 political parties, and I'm devastated to tell you, in fact, that UKIP representative couldn't make it, but I thought you'd enjoy a quote from the manifesto. UKIP believes that the local pub is a cultural tradition which moderates drinking in a social environment. UKIP will make changes to the law to make it easier for people to head down to the local for a pint. So that's what UKIP, and that's not good. So the format, as Janie said, will be simple. We're going to ask each of the speakers to speak for 5 minutes, and I'd be grateful if they could stick to that time quite precisely in order for us to have a proper conversation. Then we'll get 3 or 4 questions submitted by Scottish Artists Union members, and I hope there'll be time at the end for a bit more conversation if we're careful in how we spend the time that we do that. Okay, so can I just introduce, you've seen the names, it's Calum from Rise, Fiona from... Is that better? Yes. Sorry, I thought I was really loud. Calum from Rise, Fiona from SNP, Zara from the Green Party, Martin from the Lib Dems, Claire from the Labour Party, and Iain from the Scottish Conservatives. So I've decided to do this really democratically and do it in alphabetical order. So if we can ask Claire to do her opening comments, please.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you so much for Scottish Artists Union organising this hustings this evening. And Scottish culture is built on challenging our establishment, on refusing to accept the old maxim that we'll always do things the way they've always been done. Art pushes our boundaries and expands our understanding of the world, and it's resulted in some of the best works of literature and art coming out of Scotland. There is a welcome consensus in Scottish politics that culture and arts are important, And it was Jack McConnell, as First Minister, who gave the St Andrew's Day lecture back in 2003, who said that Labour would put culture at the heart of everything that it does. And when we were in government, we established the National Theatre of Scotland, we established the Youth Music Initiative, we put cultural coordinators into schools, and we also secured free entry into museums and galleries. Now, all politicians on the panel tonight will talk about valuing culture in Scotland, and yet there is too much evidence that there are too many people who are excluded from that within Scotland. And if you look at the household survey, if you're poor, if you're disabled, or if you're elderly, you're not benefiting from Scotland's cultural life. We need to examine this and look at where public policy and funding should be directed if we want to tackle this and see greater, more equitable engagement in our culture. In the times of financial constraint, the arts don't have, they come under a lot of pressure, they don't have statutory protection. But we need to recognise and promote the value of what art brings to individuals and our communities, and then take the decisions to promote these values. That's why I'm proud of Labour's honesty in this election, and our commitment to protect spending on culture and the arts in real terms, an investment which will bring massive benefit to our society and to our economy. We will use progressive income tax policies to invest in our national and local culture. And by replacing the council tax with a fair property tax, as well as providing local authorities with fiscal flexibility to introduce measures such as a tourism tax, we can return power to local authorities to protect their cultural programme and encourage expansion to support activity and artists in their towns and cities. And we need to also seek out greater opportunities in our health sector, our elderly provision, look at educational attainment, what greater contribution can arts and culture make to achieving our aims there. And everyone should have a cultural entitlement, and we would work with local authorities to look at a single outcome agreement for the arts. Increasingly, there are groups of people for whom a life in the arts is just not possible due to a combination of financial constraints and lack of opportunity. As Janie said, issues such as low pay, or in some cases no pay, is prevalent across the sector. And if we are to have a vibrant, varied, exciting cultural sector, we need to support ways for artists to make a living, and the role of publicly funded organisations are key to raising standards across the whole sector. We will establish a living wage commission, end the use of exploitative zero-hour contracts, and introduce the living wage across the sector. Artists will always seek exposure, but we must help to guard against exploitation. We will have a minister for micro-businesses, small businesses and entrepreneurs, and introduce a range of measures to benefit emerging and existing artists. It's important we also increase the number of apprenticeships within the creative sectors. And to achieve all this and demonstrate Labour's commitment, we'll establish a First Ministerial Committee with representatives from all cultural sectors and regions who will have the attention of the First Minister. At our manifesto launch today, Kezia Dugdale asserted her commitment to the arts, our belief that it can change and enrich people's lives. We are in tough economic times, with all our public sector facing huge financial pressures. It's not enough to talk about the importance of art. There needs to be a commitment to public investment, to the expression of our multicultural and diverse society, to inclusivity and opportunity through the arts, and appropriate support for the commercial side of the sector. A Scotland which is confident and creative is one which builds the future. We can help deliver this by placing Labour values of equality and solidarity at the heart of our policies. And Scottish Labour will support the environment for creativity to flourish and empower everyone in Scotland to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Fiona Hyslop, and I am the SNP candidate for Linlithgow. This was the scene of my first ever election campaign 24 years ago. I used to live at the bottom of Leith Walk, so it's great being back here. And also, in terms of the facilities here, there's so much happens in this venue, and indeed the opportunities for artists, particularly with the studios here, I think, again, is a great testament to the power of arts and the networking and the opportunities that are provided here. So thank you also to the Artists Union for providing the opportunity here tonight. We do have a strong and confident cultural sector in Scotland. There are many successes, but undoubtedly there's some very real challenges, and not least for individual artists. I think that's well set out in the documents you put together as an organisation yourselves. And there are unrealised potential that has to be addressed, both in those that can have access to the arts, but also for artists themselves. The role of government isn't to create art, but the role of government Yes, it's to fund, but it's not just a managerial point. It's about championing arts and culture and making sure that across all the aspects of Scotland, yes, in the public sector, but also more widely, that culture is seen as the heartbeat of Scotland, which I undoubtedly think it is. But it also means making sure that we've got the strategic direction that we can take Scotland forward. I want to make sure that we can create the conditions for culture to thrive, to celebrate all our different traditions, but also to embrace that multicultural Scotland that we have, and to make sure that we can understand the world around us, understand other peoples at a time in the world where there is great conflict and difficulty. The ability for culture to connect people, both within this country but also abroad, is something that I think we should cherish and be very conscious of. One of the things that the Scottish National Party, if re-elected, wants to develop is Scotland's first ever cultural strategy. Now, built on principles of access, of equity and excellence, it will be a strategy that's for Scotland, but also will be developed by Scotland and by artists. And I think that will give us collectively a way to make sure that we can drive forward that culture agenda. Now, access is not just for those that are consuming art or taking part in art. It's also got to be about artists, and we have to work with artists to work out what is that about access to opportunity and also funding for artists. Equity is about equality of access, equality of representation, but also about how we see Scotland in its many parts. That Edinburgh is not the be-all and end-all of culture in Scotland, and that we have to make sure that we provide opportunities across Scotland. And also excellence. We should never compromise on the capability and ability of our organisations, of our producers, of our creators, of our artists, to be able to reach and be the very best they can be, but also internationally to have that acclaim. But I want to make sure that we focus particularly on young people. We have the Year of Young People 2018. I am passionate about developing youth arts, and if the SNP are re-elected, I want to make sure that youth arts, and remember we have Scotland's first ever youth arts strategy that came from the SNP government's commitment, Time to Shine, and I want to take that forward particularly. We want to have a cultural experience fund to make sure that all primary schools can have access to our galleries, our museums, and to make sure that we can identify opportunities for them. We'll refresh the Youth Music Initiative. There have been tough times. It's easy to help support culture in a growing budget, but when you've had a reducing budget, to be able to make sure that we've looked after culture and make sure that it's been protected in recent years, and I've been the Minister over the last 7 years, is to make sure we can provide that stability. We want to create a dedicated unit for film and TV called Production Scotland that will be located within Creative Scotland that will streamline public support for the sector. And I want to see a Creative Industries Advisory Board to advise ministers directly. Self-employed experiences of many in the sector is very important, and we need to make sure that in terms of driving forward the strategy, we have that advice. I want to see a national touring fund for theatre. We have our international touring fund, which helps the excellence for the national companies, particularly, but we need to make sure we've got more sustainable theatre, providing more jobs, more opportunities for those working in theatre, but also across Scotland for people to experience the wonderful theatre that we have. And obviously, in terms of the 70th anniversary of the Edinburgh International Festival coming up, we want to enhance the Expo Fund. But that's one of the creations myself and Kenny McCaskill put that together when we were in opposition as an idea. And the benefit of that is not just during the festival itself, but it reaches all the different aspects. With the Arts Festival, or indeed with the Made in Scotland programme, artists and musicians from across Scotland can be sustained during the course of the year because of the opportunities that it provides. But that ability of a political party to understand the heartbeat of culture in our life means that whoever is in government and whoever has the responsibility for the culture brief has to make sure that they are an ambassador across all the different sectors. And with the Scottish National Party, if re-elected, that's what we want to commit to do. We want to take Scotland with us in that. I've got great confidence in the ambition and the capability of culture in Scotland, but it's not just government's responsibility, it's going to be everybody's, and it's going to be all of Scotland that will take and drive that forward.
I'm Zara Kitson and I'm Scottish Greens candidate. I'm number 2 on the regional list in Glasgow, and I'm also our spokesperson for culture. It's really great to be with you all here tonight. Thank you first of all to the Scottish Artists Union for organising the valuable hustings. It's really important to raise the voice of artists and to put culture firmly on the political agenda. These kind of events are key because not only do you get to hear from us, but you actually get to make your demands and raise your voice so that we can take them forward over the next 5 years. So please don't hold back tonight, and I'm sure that you won't. When budgets are under pressure, the arts are an easy target. Arts and culture are not optional luxuries. They're a profound part of our human experiences, and they should be valued as such. Art is an essential part of life, and it enables us to express ourselves, to connect with one another through shared experience, and to tell our stories to the world. Yet it is all too often undervalued, almost always underpaid, as I'm sure most of you are well aware, and this results in a loss to our economy and our communities. The Scottish Greens Culture Manifesto is rightly bold, going further than simply paying lip service to protection of arts and culture as it exists. Our proposed intermittent work scheme demonstrates our commitment to investment in culture as core to Scotland's economy, communities and our quality of life. It's a step forward to ensuring that artists have access to a means of living in a precarious working environment, and that their work is valued for its true worth. Whether it's our proposed overnight visitor levy to raise funds, media watchdog to improve gender equality, introduction of a new outcome for culture to measure more than simply economic success, or support for publicly owned space to be utilised for cultural activity, our proposals recognise that arts and culture are at the very heart of life in Scotland. Our progressive tax plans push for a top rate of tax of 60p in the pound for those earning more than £150,000, with those earning less than £26,500 paying less, and others on medium and higher incomes, like an MXP, for example, paying a bit more, to protect and invest in the public services that we all cherish and rely on, and invest in our arts. We believe that encouragement of cultural diversity is a prerequisite for cultural democracy. This diversity should be reflected in our cultural sector as a reflection of our ambitions as a society. We will encourage gender balance and diversity across cultural creators, producers, distributors, distribution channels and audiences, as well as those individuals responsible for governance and decision-making in creative industries. Scotland has a really rich cultural heritage, and it does well on the international stage. Scottish Green MSPs will push to remove the financial, cultural and psychological barriers to accessing arts and culture for the benefit of all, because although we recognise that Scotland does great, we believe that we can do better. Scotland can unleash our creativity, but to make that happen, we believe that Scotland needs a bolder Holyrood with more green voices in there, pushing for change, pushing our government to go that wee bit further, to unleash the potential that we have to be the country that we know we can be. Thank you.
Hello everyone. So as you can see the table has been introduced, I am Calum from Rise, Scotland's Left Alliance. And I could just start by saying thank you all for coming along tonight, and thank you to the organisers of tonight's event. It's great to see so many folk here in such an important discussion as this, especially with the weather outside as it is. We've seen blue skies, we've seen snowstorms, all too often at the same time today. It can be a very strange experience indeed. Now, in terms of arts and culture, I think Rise has a very clear, very simple view in this, that arts and culture have an inherent value to our society, an inherent value to us as people, as persons, as a community.
Excuse me, could you put the
microphone on?
Oh,
hello? Is that closer up? Do we have? Can you hear me back? Perfect. which is, I'll very briefly recap. I'm still Calum Martin from Rise, Scotland's Left Alliance. It's still snowing outside, and it will still be sunny tomorrow. Do check the weather next time. But Rise has a very clear view, I think, when it comes to the questions of art and culture. I think, in our perspective, art and the access to it is so important. Our view is that at the end of the day, there is so much more to life than working in a minimum wage job, stuck in a basement, stuck in a shop, stuck in a call centre your whole life. And for us, when we ask the questions of art and culture come up, the question for us that has to be asked is how can we not just support Scotland's artistic community, but how can we make sure that arts and culture is something which truly belongs to all of us? How can we make sure and guarantee that we all have access to that common cultural heritage we share as human beings? And I think there's a lot of things we can say about that, and I think it's especially important and powerful that it's asked this question at a time of election, because the left, I think, has a real heritage, a real tradition of standing up on this as a question. There's a real tradition as well in Scotland as a whole of saying that art is politics. The two go hand in hand. We've seen in that great left-wing tradition the Unity Theatre Company in the 1930s, where sort of the communists and the left and the socialists and the trade unions funded and stood up to use trade union funding to use theatre to tackle racism in our society. We saw the 784 Theatre Company again using arts and culture to make a point that we have a truly unequal society, and that has to change. So I think arts is valuable. The arts and the culture are valuable not just in unlocking the creative potential inside all of us, but really in terms of how we engage with the world around us, how we see the world, and the lenses through which we can help express, communicate, and change that. And I think if I could talk for a moment then about what Rise would do to help encourage that and help change that and improve that. There's three sort of key areas I think I'd like to sort of draw your attention to from Rise's policy platform. I think the first would be the importance that we see in supporting artists and supporting the artistic community. I think for starters, we've seen in Creative Scotland, there is so much more that Creative Scotland could be doing with more money, and it really is a question of priorities here. Where do we send the money? We've had numerous governments over these last couple of years, well, that much further, much beyond Scotland, all across the world. We have companies and governments, and again and again and again, making this point of pledges about what percentage of their GDP they'll spend in defence. And this is something that isn't new, but there is a great left tradition and a great Rise policy that says that we will always stand up to see at least 1% of GDP is spent not on bombing the heck out of other companies, not on guns, not on missiles for destroying human lives, destroying human societies, but 1% minimum spent on unlocking that human potential we all have, spent on culture. I think Creative Scotland can do so much more with more money, with more funding in terms of supporting aspiring, new, talented youngsters trying to set out in life. I mean, I'm sure all of us have seen this before, again and again and again. You see it at the fringe. Talented youngsters from working class backgrounds, they set up theatre companies, they have a punt as a songwriter, as a musician, as an artist. And all it takes is one fallow period, one dry month, one famine in the economy, and their dreams are shattered. Poverty crushes talent, inequality shatters dreams. And I think that's a sad fact. That it's something that Creative Scotland can, with more money and a more dynamic and bold approach, really help to challenge. But secondly, I think Rise is really strongly committed to making sure we look at challenging the cost of living crisis, which affects all of us, including our artistic community, by scrapping the iniquitous and hated council tax and replacing it with an income-based Scottish service tax. We can make sure that the richest amongst us pay their fair share, rather than, again, penalising folk on low incomes, including a great many aspiring artists, simply for looking to live in a city without earning vast sums of money. We can introduce a real living wage. It's £10 an hour is what the UK government's own figures, and the European Union's wage decency threshold says the UK average you need to be earning before you're secure in the standard of life. £10 an hour. And for the Westminster government to set the minimum wage at less than 2/3 of that is an affront. And that's something which has to change, and that is something I think which benefits artists as well as our society as a whole. And the third thing, and this leads neatly into point 2, would be making sure that we're actually creating the jobs that our creative sector needs, our artistic sector needs and deserves to keep it going. Because we've asked that question, what happens to the artists, what happens to the actors, what happens to the musicians when times get tough, when the economy dries up? People have to give up, they drop out, they wind up in call centres. It's time that we really actually took the time and took the change and took the money and the resources we need to make sure that culture and arts are accessible to everyone.
I think part of that has to be a second point, which is taking culture out to arts and communities, making sure there is truly universal access. We can provide, we have the money. Edinburgh is the second richest city in Scotland, yet we have an arts budget which is being hammered again and again and again. Arts and culture are always the first thing to feel the axe of austerity. It's true, there's no denying that. And it's a scandal. And at the end of the day, it's time to say that, you know, we can provide jobs in art, we can provide jobs in culture, going out to schools, going out to communities, community centres. People who have talent should be able to share those with the world, regardless of whether it's profitable for big corporations, because it's a fundamental, important point to our society. I think one of the ideas as well that Rise brings up, which is really, really valuable, I think, is the idea of a cultural audit in terms of our arts festivals. We look at the Edinburgh International Festival. It's the world's greatest single arts festival. I don't think anyone here would deny that. But have you seen how much some of the stuff costs? This might just be me, but I live down near Toll Cross. There was a poster up last year for the Magic Flute. I'm like, oh, fantastic, you know, great opera there, great story. £90 were the tickets. £90 to see the Magic Flute. That's not accessible. That is turning arts and culture into something which is preserved for a privileged elite. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of folk who are not necessarily Mozart fans, but I think the point stands that art should not be a reserve for the rich. It should be something that's available for all of us. And one of the ideas of the cultural audit is the idea of making sure that the Edinburgh Festival has to reach out to our society. I've been a great deal of work myself at the Edinburgh People's Festival on that very premise, that we have to make sure that our festivals work for all our communities and not just those with the cash to splash. And I think the third and final point I would really make before I'm sort of wrapping up here, keeping to time, would be that we need to respect the folk who work in this industry. We need to respect the hours of unpaid work put in by artists, the hours of unpaid work put in by aspiring young actors and musicians. But beyond that, we need to respect art teachers, teachers who've seen wages crushed again and again across Scotland. We need to respect the museum staff who've only just, at the National Museums of Scotland, come out of a bitter and long-lasting dispute with Scottish Government sectors about making sure they have their fair pay and their fair share of working conditions. And I think it's a clear message then, if I can say, just that sense that art has an inherent value. And I look forward to a day when we have a society which is not driven so much by love of money as by love of Manet, if you'll pardon the pun to finish on. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Iain McGill. I'm the Conservatives culture spokesman and the Conservatives spokesman for Leaf, so I'm a candidate here in Edinburgh, Northern and Leaf, and maybe counterintuitively for a Conservative, I have been a member of a union and when I left school I was a postman around here and I was a member of the Conservative Worker, the Communication Workers Union, get that name right, so that's almost it, man. But yeah, welcome Leaf, welcome Out the Blue, it's a fantastic venue, and I'm very pleased that they're hosting us. You'll be very familiar with the top lines. Ruth Davidson's putting them out all the time. We're campaigning very hard to be the official opposition. We accept the SNP are going to win this election. We think there's a vacancy there in Scotland for the Conservatives to be doing a job that is vacant in Scotland, where the big Labour with 6 leaders in 8 years haven't been holding the SNP government to account, and we're very keen to take that on. And there'll be a big contrast in a lot of my answers with other folks on the panel. So we're doing well. We're saying very clearly the referendum was 2 years ago and Scotland needs to take it on, concentrating on the things that matter, culture being one of them, rather than constitutional wrangling views there. You're going to hear 5 candidates here from 5 other parties, all try and tell you how it's fair to put taxes up on hard-working people, hard-working artists, on everyone. So they're going to have a wee bidding war to see who can raise taxes the most, and we're saying, no, we don't want to be putting taxes up on hard-working families. You'll be familiar with that. We're very committed to the cultural sector, as are all the other parties. So there is some consensus, and there will be a lot of consensus tonight, but I want to get those top lines out. Culture's contribution to Scotland, 174,000 jobs, 6.6% of jobs in Scotland are related to culture. And that's before we even get on to the health and well-being benefits of it. You know, and that's some of the reasons why we're all very supportive of the industry. We do share concerns around Creative Scotland. They lack a clarity of purpose. there's a lack of a coherent strategy across Scotland bringing together all the arts. So we'd be arguing strongly for them to have clarity of purpose, coherent strategy, and we'd be very keen encouraging them to be supporting folks who challenge the government, challenge the establishment, and also support making particular attention to supporting small-scale events, which are often overlooked, and supporting things in the rural communities, because we think they're often overlooked by Creative Scotland. We're very keen. We've got a very different offering on education. We've seen 152,000 college places cut by the SNP, and a move, state policy in which they're achieving, concentrating on young people on full-time courses for college places. We value that college, we value the college sector greatly, we value that there are alternatives that are equally valuable to academic careers. We would see that affecting the arts as we lose part-time courses, as we lose flexible working, and that affects the most vulnerable. It affects women particularly, it affects folks with caring responsibilities particularly, it affects returners. There's lots of different folk that affects. Looking at skills academies, bringing skills academies again, featuring training around the arts there. So there'll be some stuff there. I hope that comes up in the debate. Looking at venues, we're bringing in down south, we're bringing in the agent of change principle. We'd like to see that being brought in here. Agent of change principle, if you're not familiar, it's just if you're building housing around an established venue, it's the responsibility of the developer of the housing to do the soundproofing. And if you are building a venue around housing, then it's the responsibility of the person making the venue to do the soundproofing there. It's an idea that kicked off in Australia. We're implementing it down south. We'd like to see it implemented up here. If you're around Edinburgh, there's a consultation out just now by the council. I'd urge you to take part in that consultation there and make your views known if that sounds like something you'd be interested in. And just another thing we're looking at with regards to venues. Town centre regeneration funds are something we've argued for in the Parliament. We've had some success with them and we'll be looking to roll them out. Get town centres, get venues, get creative spaces, getting them looked at. And down south, the NHS England are funding 10 healthy towns. So as new towns are being built, they're looking at creative ways of using space. I'd urge you to have a wee look at what they're doing there. They're looking at how they can make dementia-friendly towns, how they can use towns. You can walk around all day at Alton Towers with a child and the child won't get bored, but if you try and walk around the corner to the dentist or to the school, the kids are bored. So it's looking at, just very creative ways to make the towns work better for everybody. And there's some great cultural offerings in that stuff there as well. So that's stuff we would be keen on. Hope some of that comes up.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Martin Veart. I'm with the Liberal Democrats, and I'm standing in this constituency of Edinburgh, Northern and Leith. That's still on. Hello? Hello there. That's better. Okay, I can't hear on this side of it. So, I hope it was pure coincidence that as the candidates were coming up to the table, that the Rolling Stones were playing Sympathy for the Devil. But just in case it was not, I would like to share with you my own artistic experience when I really got art. And coming from East Anglia as I do, it wasn't the arts capital of anywhere, unlike Edinburgh. So I was really, really disappointed when my then girlfriend said, okay, we're going to the ballet. I thought, oh my goodness, So fortunately, we were in St. Petersburg. Fortunately, it was the Mariinsky Theatre. And fortunately, the ballet was world class. And I was absolutely blown away for about 2.5 hours that the Tchaikovsky Sleeping Beauty was playing. So I understand what creativity and the pinnacles that it can reach. And with my background in engineering, I'm not really an arts person. So I asked a lot about what's happening here in Scotland, beyond obviously my own front door here in Edinburgh. And it's a lot of good news here. That the theatres are doing well, that the authors are staying, who are selling a lot of books, and the arts overall are doing very well. So I said, okay, what's the bad news? And it was summed up in 2 words: Creative Scotland. Now, that surprised me. I was disappointed to hear it wasn't working, but after researching it, I understand that most of the funding for Creative Scotland goes to those large companies who already have. The Scottish Artists Union, most of its membership are sole traders, and most of the 87% of all arts enterprises employ less than 5 people. The vast majority of those people who are putting in not claims, but proposals into Scotland, Creative Scotland, are having them refused, and when the answer comes as to why they're being refused, it's not clear. Now, I understand that Creative Scotland has gone through several revisions in 2012 and in 2014, that they also have launched a new 10-year policy. Liberal Democrats want to listen to artists such as yourselves in order to see if it's working. If it's not working, then we would be up for reform or even start again on Creative Scotland, because we want an arts system that works nationally, but we don't want to dictate to artists. So I'm a little bit wary of the, having a cultural strategy. As far as I can see, arts funding is there to facilitate what the artist wants to say, rather than guide and even dictate. And in order to do that, the funding has to be available not just centrally, but locally as well. So that's why we are looking at reforming local authorities' ability to raise taxes, freeing them from the shackles of the freeze that has been imposed now for many a year here in Scotland, and then allowing them to spend up to 50% of their own revenue in ways that is decided. So if there's a good local arts case to be made, it can be made to your local people across Scotland, rather than having to go to a central court. Our main policy, and it's already been alluded to by Iain here, that we want to raise taxes by 1p, and we think that it's necessary. And the penny that we want to put on taxes is for education. Now, education has been cut systematically for almost a decade now. And the 475 million that we'll raise on that will go to our further education, reversing the cuts there. Now, a lot of further education places are part-time, and they're the ones that have been very badly hit indeed. And they're the ones also that art is often a go-to when they want to improve their own talents and get their input. So we want to do that. We want to also, we've noticed that music fees in our schools, for instance in Fife, the music tuition charges have gone up by 29%, and that is because of the cuts in local funding to both schools and local councils. We want to reverse those cuts and have as much funding for our young musicians as free as possible. And also, we want to get more arts into the community, and we are willing to listen to very different ways. For instance, mental health is another big one for us Liberal Democrats. And there is a prescription for involvement in local arts projects that can be made. This is very good for depression, for loneliness, and this is what we want to achieve. So, to summarise, we want to return the spending decisions to you and to make the national spending decisions through Creative Scotland more applicable and more available to the small artistic companies which occur throughout Scotland. That's our free platforms. And also, one further one, I said, okay, what's the other piece of bad news that we've got? Sorry, I'm a politician. I tend to focus on the bad stuff rather than the good. We've got no film industry to speak of. We can only offer on location here. We've got no film studios. Now, Cardiff has done very well with the Doctor Who and the BBC funding there. Northern Ireland is looking now at a second major film studio with additional film stages through their success on the Game of Thrones. Meanwhile, if you're in Scotland and you're a budding filmmaker, you have to go elsewhere, really. It's very difficult to find the facilities here in Scotland. Now, there are various ways we can do that. Liberal Democrats want to have at least encourage one large film studio with some stages, and then have smaller local stages available to foster that local talent as well. So, we are very engaged in the arts. We, of course, support everything that's been said positively here. And for the health of our communities, we do want to see thriving arts, and we want to see arts being properly funded. Thank you very much.
There's a sense there of a degree of consensus, I think, that there's a lot of warm words around the significance and the importance of our arts and cultural lives, but I suspect you as an audience would like to get into some specifics about how it affects you in your role as an artist, members of the Scottish Artists Union. And we've got some individuals, I think, who have some questions that they would like to put to the panel. So I think John Aiscough.
It's quite interesting to hear what the panel have said this evening. And I think I've probably got some friends on the panel. But I guess this question, for obvious reason, I'm going to direct Fiona Hyslop. I'm curious to hear what other people have to say. So my name's John Aiscough. I'm an artist living and working in Scotland. My practice relates to and investigates notions of social justice. Over the past few years, I've undertaken some projects with a number of charities that work with people on the peripheries of society, those who are excluded for one reason or another. These could include young people, older people, the abused, unemployed, homeless, etc., etc. And my question relates to the public gallery system, which all too often charges exhibition entry fees. The question is this. So public galleries are financed by you and me, the taxpayer, to exhibit artworks for the benefit of the population of Scotland. However, all too often the galleries that are funded by government charge a ticket price which excludes a large number of individuals, including the unemployed, homeless, students, families on low income, etc., etc. Public sector galleries are therefore elitist and target the privileged. Art must be for everybody, regardless of circumstance. Would the panel agree? If yes, what will you do to change this? If no, what is the function of the public art gallery, and why is art tax being used to supplement those who already have?
I think that's a question that all the panel members would have a view on. It's very important in difficult times and reducing budgets that we have kept our national galleries free for access, and also our museums. And that's something, I mean, I'm not sure that anybody in the panel is looking to change, but that's also been a struggle to do that financially. But one of the issues that you may point about is not the general access, it's the specialist exhibitions I think you're referring to. And it's one of the things I have in my capacity as Culture Minister regularly addressing the National Gallery of Scotland. It's one of the reasons why I've developed, in terms of the manifesto commitment, to a cultural experience fund, primarily for young people, but I can see your point about other parts of society where people might not have immediate access to go and see the most amazing exhibitions that we've had. Extremely successful national galleries have had one of the most successful years for a long time, and a lot of it is bringing challenging work, and visual art can particularly reach out and touch people and connect, and that's one of the reasons, for example, artist rooms, particularly that was one of the areas where we wanted to work to make sure, and having talked to Anthony Duffy, he particularly wanted teenagers who felt alienated from society to be able to see great modern art. It's one of the reasons why Generation, hugely successful, 70 venues and for free, not just in Edinburgh, all over Scotland. And Douglas Gordon, when I spoke to him, said he was more thrilled about going to Thurso and exhibiting there than anywhere else. But when I speak to national galleries, I've said to them, what about Falthouse, West Lothian, small mining area, and the land that time forgot in many ways because it's right in the centre of Scotland, but people don't have access. And until such times as and young people from Faltex have as much access to see public exhibitions as anywhere else, then we don't have true equity. So I'm not saying it's an easy solution, but your challenge is not to generally about the National Galleries, but it's for the specialist exhibitions. And when the vast majority of their staff their costs go on staffing, that's a real challenge. We make sure they're all paying the living wage. But when we said that when Scotland voted no in the referendum, when we got Tory government continuing, there's £1 billion of cuts of austerity coming down the track in Scotland by the end of this decade. And that's going to have an impact in all parts of life. So some of it is holding what we have, but also how do we reach out? And I absolutely get your point. And I think visual art, amongst any other art forms, can really connect with people. So I can't just say overnight I'm going to wave a magic wand and all of a sudden these paid-for exhibitions are suddenly coming free. But what I can do is try and make sure and commit with, as I have had those discussions, how do we broaden out the access? It might not be everybody all immediately. And that's what the Cultural Experience Fund that we're starting would be all about if we're elected.
Yeah, but can I just retort? So, but that's these spaces, it's an institution which we're all paying for. Okay, and my tax, the tax that I pay, I want to go. The tax that's paid for the gallery system needs to allow everybody who wants to. The people who are excluded from these shows and exhibitions are probably or possibly those who would benefit most. And with all due respect, there are loads of great shows that are for free, absolutely, but I'm not talking about those. I'm not actually talking about, I suspect that production of whatever it was that you saw for 90 quid was probably a private production. But I'm not talking about private production, I'm talking about public spaces that unless you've got some cash in your pocket, you can't go into. What are you going to do about that?
I mean, I think John raises a fair point when it comes to the specialist exhibitions, that they are very expensive to get into and a lot of people are excluded. And while it is very welcome that the vast majority of exhibitions are free to access, there is an issue there. There was also, we had a debate in Parliament before recess where we talked about the expansion of the National Gallery, the new space that's been built on. At the same time, there was an exhibition you had to pay for to go and see women artists. Within the National Galleries, women artists are completely underrepresented. And that was a good opportunity to say, now we're having this expansion, we need to make sure the expansion actually reflects more opportunities for people to see work that they can't usually see. That was particularly disappointing in the women artists one, that there was a price attached to that when it was such an important exhibition. So I think, in Labour's commitment to protect spending on culture in real terms, Kezia made 4 commitments today for real terms protection. It was health, justice, education and culture.
I'm not a government minister, I'm not an MSP. I work every day with the most vulnerable, excluded groups in society, and my day-to-day experience of that, there was a cross-party bill a few years ago. The self-directed support bill was meant to be transformational for our most vulnerable in society. And my day-to-day job is advising folks on mental health conditions, what lawyer to get to take the council to court just to get their basic rights under self-directed support so they can fund themselves to do more than have someone come to give them their medication in the morning. So it's a slightly different angle at it, is I want to see just...
But SDS is a real goddle.
It is. It's 5 years into this plan. It's an absolute farce. It needs sorted out, and the country's been distracted whilst folks have been failed there. And I would just say that thing of £1 billion in Tory austerity cuts coming down the line, it doesn't wash anymore. There's tax varying powers in the Scottish Parliament. There are 5 different views here on the left there as to just how much they want to raise by raising taxes to get that funding. So blaming it on Westminster doing it. If you want to raise extra taxes, Fiona, do it. Use the powers. Take it. And you'll hear the other guys say 60 pence in the pound, 50 pence in the pound, 45. You hear the guys bidding there. Fiona, it doesn't wash to say Westminster made us.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that the small-scale funding, which I was talking about, with Scotland, Creative Scotland. Small-scale funding, okay, is in a national exhibit, and the artists there hopefully want to make some money out of it. but it's the kind of national exhibition space which could be supported by national spending.
Thanks for your question, John. John, you're absolutely right. Arts needs to be accessible for all, and that means everyone in our society. I grew up in a wee ex-mining village just outside of Stirling called Fallin, and probably the first time I came to any of our national galleries was when I took myself there when I went to uni when I was 17. And before then I had very limited access or experience of arts and culture because of growing up and living in poverty, and that is a very real experience for many of our people, children and young people, and it does put you at a disadvantage compared to everyone else who doesn't have that barrier to accessing. I think there's a couple of wider points here that are very important to raise. I think the financial barrier, there's already a million barriers to accessing culture, and even walking into a public gallery, there's psychological and cultural barriers there. Just by being from a deprived area in Scotland, you've already got a feeling in your mind that that's not for you, it's for somebody else. So the barriers are already there and they're thick and fast, so then to put another barrier in place that's one of financial burden, when you know that you don't actually have access to the money to pay to get into that, is a double whammy for the people that we're talking about that you work with, John. And I think it's absolutely crucial that we do begin to unpick this and to put some challenge actually to the way that we are funding arts and culture, because what we're seeing throughout Scotland is a creeping in of charges and service charges for all of our public services, not just for our public galleries, and it is particularly potent at local level when we're seeing cuts to local authority budgets, so then people are having to pay to access care services, for example, or to access entry into leisure facilities and other facilities that should be publicly funded services. So I think the key piece to this actually is about how we raise revenue, and we need to have a conversation about that, because the cuts are not inevitable and they don't need to be passed on from Westminster through Holyrood through our local authority services. There are solutions to that. There are many parties that have offered solutions to that, and I think we should be loud in pushing for some of these solutions to be listened to. Scottish Greens are proposing a progressive tax policy which would raise £331 million more than the SNP's tax proposals, for example, and that's without including our proposals to scrap the council tax and bring in a residential wealth tax, a residential property tax at local level as well. And I think that we've got a key opportunity actually to do something different in Scotland with the new powers coming our way. So I, for one, am happy to be here pushing for us to use those powers, because what you're talking about, John, is about how we can push forward reducing the inequality gap in Scotland, and that should be everyone's #1 priority, because every child and young person growing up in our country deserves to have the same opportunities as everyone else, regardless of the income that they're on, and we need to close that income gap and make sure that in all of our policies we're ensuring that there's equality of access, and having charges to a public service like a national gallery is not achieving that.
I think, John, that is 100%, this is 100% the right question to be asking. I gave the example before of being priced out of Edinburgh International Festival shows. I think that, it's obviously, there's an issue there. But this is, even just in terms of the public sector, there's a huge issue here. You gave the example of us being priced out of these museum galleries, but the problem is actually much deeper than that, I think, in a way. I mean, it was recently the birthday of a certain Miss Elizabeth Windsor of 1 Buckingham Street somewhere in London. And I'm sure there's a question there about the properties and paintings and the real cultural treasures that the Queen looks after for us at our expense. Some of Scotland's, some of Britain's, some of the world's greatest pieces of art, pieces of culture are kept tucked away in places where we never see them at our tax expense. Even if you go to the museums, you look at these museums and art galleries, there's massive, massive stock rooms full and full and full, the stately homes full of some of the greatest gems and treasures of art that the human race has ever produced. And we're told that we can't see them, even though we're funding their upkeep, because goodness knows why. It's because we're not dukes, we're not barons, we're not part of the royal family. We're too low and humble to see these things. And I think that we've touched about, it's been touched upon there, but there is a real psychological barrier a lot of the time to actually allowing people to engage with these things. And I think one of the really good things, one of the great ideas that we could be looking at in terms of overcoming those barriers is actually saying that these paintings, these portraits, these gems of our common cultural heritage don't belong to be tucked away in some stately home or some royal palace or some little mansion somewhere. They should be travelling, they should be out on display. Why do we have pieces of art stuck away in back rooms when they could be travelling from place to place, actually reaching out into our communities rather than being tucked away behind financial barriers, psychological barriers, social barriers, royal barriers? There's little ticker tape barriers they put to kind of channel cues, which in of themselves are, well, a different issue there. But in terms of, he's made a point about, we'll be taxing. And I can give you an assurance that Rise, for what it's worth, will not be putting massive tax hikes on hard-working and low-earning artists. But we will put substantial tax hikes to make the rich pay their fair share, to make sure that the folk who would hoard away and deny us access to our common cultural heritage, to the arts and culture we should all have access to, will make them pay their fair share of tax. And that money can be used to make sure that the treasures and gems of Scotland's art are available to all of the people who would make Scotland their home. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That's really great. I think, like you were suggesting, this is just the tip of the iceberg. The system's being dismantled and we don't seem to give a shit. But obviously this is the Artists' Union and I needed to be quite specific. But I don't think, Fiona, your answer really took me anywhere that I really would like to have been. So I won't be voting for you this time. But thank you.
I work in the National Galleries of Scotland, so I just felt quite it was important for me to say something here. I'm the schools coordinator at the National Galleries of Scotland. What I hear from teachers, the top 2 barriers that stop our schools from visiting the National Galleries of Scotland. The first barrier, the biggest barrier that I hear, is that they can't get their classes out of timetable. That's the number 1 barrier. It's a bigger barrier than transport and cost. Those are the next, second and third barriers. There is a travel subsidy fund that supports schools to go to some cultural venues in Scotland. It doesn't include the National Galleries. I wonder if that might change in future. The third barrier is actually the cost, and we do have to charge schools for some of the activities that we provide for them at the National Galleries. That's come in recently. Well, there's always been some charges. The charges have increased recently due to year-on-year budget cuts that we've had.
The answer is yes. That's why the manifesto has a cultural experience fund to address precisely that, to make sure the National Galleries is now part of a subsidy fund to make sure that young people can access films.
Hi, I'm Aileen Rutherford. I'm a visual artist, currently based in Glasgow, and among other things, I run a project called People's Bank of Govan Hill. So my question, it's kind of a 2-part question to ask the whole panel. Are the panel aware that the majority of artists living and working in Scotland are living in poverty? So the recent Scottish Artists' Union survey from 2015 shows that 64% of the members are earning less than £5,000 a year. And the artist pay hasn't increased for many years, and it's probably going down. So given that the arts and creative industries are recognised as providing a major economic income for Scotland, is it acceptable that so many working artists are living in poverty?
Yes, was the answer to your first question. It is very much that artists are either expected to live in poverty at this moment if they're self-employed, or have a second job in order to so the arts are not valued. Now, part of the thing that standing up on this side is that you listen to answers and you learn stuff as well. For instance, I wasn't previously aware that the universal benefit is. I'm currently unemployed myself at the moment through layoffs in the heavy industry. The universal benefit for the self-employed top-up was going to be only if you were making a profit. Now that would be something very solid that we could direct at other nations through the tax system. I'm thinking of the Republic of Ireland, for example, are able to support their artists on the basis of not paying tax or even national insurance contributions for the self-employed. So there's a range of innovations that you could look at, and I'm going to keep an open mind on all of them, because we do need to value the art, and that means valuing the artist.
Thank you for your question. There's a few points I'd like to make. When I got this role for Scottish Labour looking at culture, I went round about Scotland trying to meet with people and find out what the key priorities were. And one of the three things I came up with was, how do you make a living in the cultural sector in Scotland? And when I went to visit Dundee Contemporary Arts Centre, it was quite clear there that many artists have more than one job. The creative side is part of what they do, but also they're working in cafes or they're doing wardens within museums and galleries. So there's a diversity there of employment. I think Scottish Enterprise doesn't recognise as a body how to support artists or cultural people. I think it's far too large an organisation and doesn't understand how that operates. We would establish a First Ministerial Committee so that the First Minister could hear directly from the sector, and the priorities could be set along with the First Minister. And while Fiona's in the Cabinet, which is important, and I welcomed her move into Cabinet, I think the broader issues around the creative sector and the cultural industries need to be, the First Minister would need to be greater aware of what the challenges are within the sector. I think our policies as well around local authorities, if you're looking at how artists can have more diverse incomes and the role that local authorities can play, when we see this year there's going to be £500 million worth of cuts going to local authorities. When we talk about cultural spend, while Creative Scotland are important, a lot of the activity actually happens at local authority level and is funded by our local authorities. If our local authorities were better funded, we would be supportive of and encouraging greater involvement of artists within a wider aspect of our life, within our health provision, within our schools, within other employment services. As John said, he's working with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, so he's bringing his talents and experience into other areas, and I think if local authorities were better funded, there would be more opportunities for that type of activity. Also in the opening statement I talked about the living wage and the importance. I think if you look at applications that are made to Creative Scotland, we need to really look at, when they give out grants, how much weighting or attention is given to the type of salaries and wages that will be paid either to the artists or the people who are working.
Yeah, a few things with regards to Creative Scotland. There, we know they were able to disperse £90 million in the most recent round of funding. We know there was 200 million worth of bids though, and we also know there's plenty of folks have been put off by the whole process of bidding, so we know there was even more interested. We've got a big concern there and would like to see things done a bit different. There's a danger that the smaller scale cultural events lose out on this. We know these can be essential sources of income, especially in some of the more remote rural communities. And so, that's more on the creative side. Just some of the big stuff that we're talking about. We have introduced a living wage across the country. We have raised the tax allowance before folks start paying in. We are pushing for the flexible working that folks do. Folks do need full-time. 9 to 5 doesn't suit everybody, and especially doesn't suit many in the creative side of things, and we've made it easier for folks to get started in business. So that's some of the stuff that we've got in our offer.
I think that figure of 64, was it 64%? Was that figure? Yeah. I mean, that is an absolute scandal. And that is something we should be more widely known. I have to confess, I didn't know that until I read the report of the Scottish Artists Union before. But to be honest, I'm not entirely surprised, I have to admit. I mean, we live in a society where we live in a society which does not give proper value to arts, that does not give a proper value to human endeavour, but it deserves. We have a society which is so driven by the need for corporate profit, or corporate greed, but anything which is not seen as furthering that, as greasing those wheels, is so often seen as secondary, is swept aside. And I think in some sense we really need to have real cultural change on this front. We need to have cultural and economic change, which really changes and challenges perception of the arts as being somehow secondary to sort of, corporate machines. arts and the culture have such an important role to play in our society, and it is so important that artists are given their due. You know, artists contribute so much to our society with the music, the talents, the creative output they put. And there's a number of ways I think that we can work to change that. The first is that Rise has a number of platforms and policies which we've worked with, put forward to see how we can do it. I think one is the living wage, making sure that, you know, for folk in any kind of work, you're getting that £10 an hour living wage we talked about earlier, to make sure that folk can pay their own way in work. But secondly, there's an idea which has been looked at and experimented in this way about a basic citizen's income, making sure that everyone right off the bat receives automatically enough to get by, to make sure that if you're an unpaid carer, you get by. If you're an artist with some real talents to offer to your society, you can get by. If you're struggling between jobs, you can get by. To make sure that if you're working in a terrible wage job, we haven't quite got that living wage campaign one yet, you can still get by. So there's a number of ways we can change the way we can change our wage system for the better and make real change there. The last thing I would say is in terms of creating jobs. We talked about before about widening access to culture. When you widen access to culture, you create jobs. When you create jobs in culture, you widen access to that culture. You know, we talked before about this idea of taking cultural gems out of stockrooms and bringing them to our communities. It takes people to do that. That creates jobs. We've talked about ring fencing, you know, the arts budgets and culture budgets for local councils, for local schools. That creates jobs. It takes arts teachers, it takes drama teachers. People have real talents in these realms and these fields that they can and should share. And I think it's only right that we're saying if people have talents and they're willing to share them, then we should 100% support that. Because at the end of the day, what is an education for? Is an education just to line us up for another job, you know, flipping burgers, selling shoes, or stuck in a minimum wage job? Or is an education about developing us as people? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Ailey, and congratulations on your work on the People's Bank of Govanhill. I'm a fan. So, work should always pay, and nobody in work should be living in poverty. That's the bottom line. So no artist or anyone else in our country that's working should be living in poverty. But we have a ridiculous situation where far too many of our people and of us are actually living in poverty, despite the fact that we're actually contributing to our economy. And artists are no different in that. And there's a few things. So first of all, Scottish Greens have a few proposals to look at the situation that artists often find themselves in, where between work contracts you end up having to sometimes actually move completely away from your art because you can't afford to pay your rent or to live. So as a result, you end up maybe having to work in a bar or a call centre, and it means that you're not able to keep up your practice. And this is a huge loss to the cultural sector because it means that you don't retain the skills that you've actually been trained up to do. So often our young people are going to art college or university and being trained up to practice their art, and then when they come out they maybe get kind of a few contracts, but in between times they are having to drop out, and all of that education that we've invested in as a country goes down the drain, or they have to move abroad to get a job, and again what we've invested in, those skills and that talent, we're losing it to going abroad. So there's a wider picture that we need to consider here, but a key proposal that Scottish Greens have is for an intermittent work scheme, which is a compensation payment, a monthly compensation payment that artists would get in between work contracts, which should mean, and it's the equivalent to job seekers allowance, so it's not a huge amount of money, but it means that you at least have something so that you're not having to live in complete poverty, but you've at least got some money to tide you through until the next work contract. So that's a key commitment from us, and it is something that we can do with new powers that are coming our way, because Scotland is going to have control over social security policies. So this is something that we could actually bring in this next term of government, and it wouldn't cost very much. And as I've already pointed out, the investment that we'd get back would be greater, because it would mean we're not losing out on that talent, which is a huge loss to our economy. So that's one point, but obviously that doesn't solve the immediate concern of actually pay and a living pay that mean that artists aren't living in poverty. So a greater living wage is a key component of that. So we believe that a real living wage is £10 an hour, not just for artists but for everyone, and that's been evaluated at a wage that actually people need to live on to be able to not be in work poverty. So we will continue to push for a greater living wage, and long term we believe that citizens' income is the best way for us to actually manage our economy, because, as has already been pointed out by Calum, it actually means that we can shift the way that our economy operates, so that it's not just run for the benefit of corporations, but it's run for the benefit of people, because surely that is what an economy is and should be based on. It is people that create wealth, so that it is people that should benefit from that wealth as well. So a basic citizens' income would mean that everyone in society would have a basic monthly income paid to them, and then it means that you can, if you choose to go and study, if you choose to practice your art, if you have care responsibilities, it means that you would be able to do them, and it also means that you would move away from a stigma for people that are on benefits as well. So it achieves a few things, and it actually frees up our system and our people, so that, and you find that people will become more creative. It's actually being piloted just now in a few countries across the world, so I'm watching with interest to see how that looks out, and I think we will continue to push for citizens' income to be trialled here in Scotland, because I think that it will achieve that shift in the economy that we so desperately need, because the gap in income inequality is getting greater, and it is causing us grave concerns. So I think that these are key and bold priorities that we have to actually try and achieve the change that we all want to see.
Thank you very much, Aileen. Just see you there. Thank you. A number of things are in this. One is the general point about the value on arts and making sure that those that are in the sector are valued and level. And people don't probably appreciate outside this room. Everybody in this room knows, I think, the issues of poverty and low wages in the sector. I think if you ask the general public, they wouldn't be aware of that. That's why the work of the Artists' Union is really important in making sure people are aware of that. People do think differently, I think, in the world outside this room, perhaps, and I think that has to be challenged. One of the things that I'm very proud that the SNP government did was to introduce the living wage as a national policy. And across the public sector, we're doing it across the cultural sector and the public side, but also in the private sector. That's really important. What the UK government has brought in as a living wage is not a living wage, it's just a variation on the minimum wage. And one of the things that I've committed to with other unions in the cultural sector is to work with them to make sure that we can have the living wage in Scotland being applied across the cultural sector, particularly in discussions with the Edinburgh Festival, for example, in relation to the Fringe, but also in the different bodies that are in receipt of monies that come from government. So that should also start, getting a culture and appreciation of the importance of the living wage across the sector. In terms of the expansion of bursaries, that's very important. Artist residencies can also help with that. And also the work with the Saltire Society, of which Jim is heavily involved, is trying to find a different way in Scotland for not just the public sector, but those in the private sector who want to support in terms of investment and support for artists, different means by getting funding to individual artists. I think creating a big bureaucracy could probably cost more than it necessarily provides, but any ideas that we can look at, I'm very interested in. But we can't have this idea that people just do it for love. They need to pay the rent, they need to pay their bills. The idea in terms of musicians, the idea people will do it for free if it's for a charity. And that's a mindset and it's a behaviour, and we have to change that. And that's part of the championing I talked about in terms of culture across the areas. There isn't an instant solution. There's always been poverty in this sector, but it's not something we have to accept. There's things that can be done to change it, and we'll be open to many ideas. And I've heard a number of ideas from yourselves as a union, but I think as part of the unions across the cultural sector, I think if you came together and worked with government, I think we find a solution that will make a real difference to individual people's lives.
What would you do?
What would I do in this situation? I think the Greens' proposals are probably the most realistic in terms of actually trying to make a difference in this situation. But I think one of the things that really needs to be looked at in terms of the living wage is that stating an hourly amount for the living wage doesn't really work very well for artists, because we're by and large paid per commission or per exhibition or per piece of work. An hourly rate doesn't really make any sense. It needs to be done, you need to look at what you're earning per year, not per hour.
It's actually really nice to hear most of the parties being able to articulate genuine positions on this issue, so that's been very gratifying to hear. The other point I would state before I get into this, I'm a member of the Scottish Artists Union. I work in the arts and health sector. But the thing I would say is the biggest subsidiser of the arts in this country are the artists, because they're actually going off and holding down second jobs, and that's what keeps the arts sector alive. And it's about time that politicians woke up to that. But the point I submitted as a question in relation to local authorities, there has been a lot said already about access and about local delivery, and that's great, and people are thinking in those terms. But do the panel members consider it appropriate that local authorities are actually becoming more distant in their support for and engagement with the arts? Passing responsibility to arm's length trusts, removing culture budgets entirely, or having them subsumed within other broader departments? What is the best way to safeguard arts funding and infrastructure at a local level?
Yeah, I do really welcome that question. It's interesting, the issue of trust. I'm a Fife MSP, and we did set up a cultural trust a few years ago, and obviously Glasgow has one of the bigger trusts. I suppose the move towards it was a way of trying to bring more revenue in and bring more expertise into the area. And I think in Fife it's been quite successful because there's been a strong approach to partnership. So the local authority hasn't completely stepped away from it at all. And recently we've had the opening of the Creative, which was the old fire station in Dunfermline was converted into studio spaces. That was achieved through a partnership between individual artists, the trust and the local authority working together. So I'm not saying trusts are the ideal model, and I recognise the concerns around democratic control, but I think if they're established in a way that brings partnership into it and includes the artists in the creative sector, there can be quite successful role models. But at the moment, the push from councils that are considering it at the moment is to do with budget cuts, and it would be short-sighted of a council who doesn't recognise the potential there is for arts and culture to bring benefits to their communities. Often I think you need to have a champion within the council. Either that's where you as an organisation, while it's really welcome that you're engaging with us, it's important you also engage with your local authorities and make relationships with councillors, and make sure they understand the importance of what art brings to their communities, and that the local organisations have relationships there. Because I think a lot of it is to do with having a champion there who's a politician, and also having officers there who understand the value of arts. And if you get those two things working, then you've got people in there fighting your corner in an area that isn't protected. It's not got statutory protection. It will need people into there to fight for it. But coming again to tax policies, that is why we're prepared. The choice between accepting the austerity or using the powers of the Parliament, we'll use the powers of the Parliament and put money into our local authorities and try to protect these services.
I think it's an incredibly important question. I think there is two aspects, I think, that to my mind would have to be addressed to that. The first would be the actual issue of where is the funding, what is the funding situation? Because we've seen it before, we've seen it again, that all too often when we see councils setting up trust funds, it's cuts by stealth. We've seen it, I think look at Eastern Berkshire Council was a recent example of this. Their libraries, everything about the libraries, the cultural outreach centres, all of them suddenly became trust funds all of a sudden. And all that meant was all of a sudden the actual amount of money available to culture and the arts and libraries starts dwindling away. And what money is left starts dwindling upwards to the executives at the top. So I think for the first point, we have to actually look at what's happening with council money, full stop, and also how we're raising it. I think our proposed Scottish service tax to replace the council tax for local income tax, make sure that kind of hard-working and low-earning artists aren't being whacked in the face of a massive council tax burden that bears no correlation to our ability to pay, whilst making sure the richest amongst us do pay their fair share. So I think there's real issues that we can look at and really address using the powers that Holyrood already has in terms of making sure we have true tax justice and proper support for our local councils and local council services. Now, the second aspect of that, I think, is how do we make sure that the money is actually being used appropriately? I mean, we've seen with the trust all too often that money just gravitates upwards to executives at the top who are happy to kind of sit and preside over great meetings without actually ever really doing a great deal of what they're meant to. Or even worse, we see things like the PFI schemes where it's kind of leased even further out to private companies, and the result is we pay millions and billions of pounds towards big private companies who don't deliver what they were meant to in the first place. So PFI art galleries are clearly not the answer, before anyone suggests that. But I suppose the other thing, in that point, the answer then really has to be that I think councils need to understand that. So I do know what I'm trying to say, I'm just trying to turn it into words. I think councils do need to understand that artists do have their own vision, that it doesn't have to be sort of mangled through some kind of corporate machine which says, oh, what's the profit implications of it? Will this be a profitable return? Is it a sound investment? Is it going to have good monetary consequences? Arts investment always has sound and important and vital returns. Investing in the cultural dynamic and the cultural future of our country is something we should always be looking at. And I think one of the great initiatives that we could be supporting is our instances of where artists are self-organising, coming together to work together to produce a vision of what they can do. I think the Edinburgh People's Festival is a great example of that. An artist collective community which says that, which is about making sure that access exists, making sure that flourishing young artists without the resources to succeed are given that backing. And I think that's where I'd leave it at that point. Thank you.
I also share concerns as to what the development of trusts would mean for democratic accountability. So I initiated and supported funding for research into that specific area as to what were the benefits of trust organisation versus direct democratic accountability. And the only benefit of trust particularly seemed to be, well, you can be exempt from VAT. Now that might help financially, but that was it. Now we don't have control of that in the Scottish Parliament, but a lot of effort has gone into developing new trusts, etc. And I think there's a really big issue about public accountability for trusts more generally. So again, the jury's out on this. It's something I know the Parliament has and will continue to look into, but I specifically commissioned research into that to find out what would the impact be. There are a few myths I just want to bust. Council's share of funding, government funding, has been maintained over the last period under an SNP government. And despite the fact that culture is not a statutory responsibility like other areas governed by law by councils, I've kept a very close eye on spending by local authorities to see whether, in times of difficulty, because there have been pressures everywhere, has there been a disproportionate reduction in culture spending compared to, say, social care or other areas. And to date, there has not been, right? And why is that? Because if you look at the councils particularly who have grabbed the opportunity, who see that culture can help regeneration, can help so much in their communities, they know themselves politically people will not react well if their theatres close, etc. You see places like Airgate Theatre developing, reopening cinemas, reopening in towns and communities across Scotland. So it's not all doom and gloom, and it's a very trite thing to say, oh, in times of difficulty, culture gets cut first. Actually, in Scotland, it hasn't. And the reason I think it hasn't to date, things are difficult for everybody, but the reason why it's not been disproportionately cut to date is I think there is a belief at all levels that culture does matter. I'm not, I can't forecast the future where things will go, but that's the experience that we've had to date. Obviously, we've got to keep a very close eye on it, but your point specifically was about trust, and there's some very successful ones, but there's also very successful democratic control. And my worry about trust is when things get more difficult, potentially, in the future, what would happen to trust compared to direct responsibility for councils within the culture sector. Very important area, something that all the parties, I think, have been looking very closely at.
I was, as I said in my opening statements, Mayor, that the Liberal Democrats want to return accountability to local levels. That means giving spending powers back to local authorities, and also lifting there's penalty clauses on local authorities as well. If they spend their money in certain directions, we want to see that lifted from central government. So it's really about returning accountability to local people. as to your point about the biggest subsidy of arts is the artists, yeah, tell me about that. My wife had a photograph recently in a local hospital exhibition, and somebody tried to barter her down on it. When the person was told how much it cost to produce art, then they paid the price. I think there's a lot of communication here about art, and actually I agree with Calum on this. Art has to be seen as more than just a market commodity, because people don't realise the actual time and the effort that goes in to create a single piece. So that's why, say paid by the hour, and that might work for some kind of arts when you've got performing arts, for example. But when you've got art by commission, that's very difficult for us. But to answer your direct question, back to local communities, spend it there in your local communities, and then the local politicians are accountable for their actions to the local artists.
Perfect, thank you. Some of the stuff, trusts, they have some good points. They can access funding. Fiona said they can access funding there. Good luck getting a change in VAT. It's not a council or a Holyrood or a Westminster. It's an EU change. So the fight just to get the tampon tax, the VAT on tampons change there. But yeah, so trusts they can be a good model. We'll have to look at what works. We would have a presumption. The Conservatives would also have a presumption about devolving decisions down to the lowest level. Concerns about the centralisation. You talked about money being sucked up to high-paid chief executives. That sounds like a council to me rather than a decent trust. And just something we've got in a manifesto that I'm excited about that might apply to some stuff is we've got community right to bid, which is if the council's providing a service and there's folks in the community think they could do a better job than the council, then the council have to look at that. So we'd be encouraging communities across the country to look at stuff councils are providing and see, could we set something up that could provide this better? And then the council would have to defend why they've got that provision there, but because we see communities as being well able to provide some services better than the councils do, so we'd be going a wee bit further to empower communities there.
So I think there's positives and negatives with trusts, and because I think sometimes when actually having a model that's outside of local councils actually frees people in communities up to be more creative. But what's very important is that we have to marry that up with democratic accountability and transparency, and I don't think that they've necessarily developed that at the same time. When we've seen a move to trust, we've not had legislation that's actually meant that communities and public are still in control and in charge, and I think that that's really important that we begin to triangulate that, because there are positives there. In terms of how we specifically safeguard arts funding, though, I mean, obviously part of it is having the money in the local authority to begin with. So we've got specific proposals to scrap the council tax and propose residential tax, which would be based on the wealth of properties rather than the current council tax, which is based on values of properties that are probably about the same age as me. So, they're very outdated. Not that I'm outdated, mind you, but certainly the council tax is. I think that, and we are proposing solutions like this because actually when local government is allowed and able to raise its own income, then it means it can better respond to local need and work better in partnership with people, rather than when we have a trend towards centralisation and outsourcing, it doesn't allow for that connect to community, and that's often where arts is taking place and culture. It's at that local level, and that's where the connections need to be. We're proposing an outcome for culture as well, and that would be to run through all government departments so that we're seeing that prioritisation of culture as core and essential to every part of life and all parts of policy, rather than something that's just an add-on, and that's really core and key for us. There was one more thing that I wanted to mention and I've forgotten it now. Charges, outcome for culture. No, I forgot. Oh, education. That's Education is also a key way that I think we can ensure that we safeguard spending on arts and culture, and we want to specifically push to have more priority given within education budgets for arts and culture, creativity education in schools as well, and linking to that outreach, because we're seeing a trend now where cuts to education is meaning that there's charges for things like music tuition and other services in school. Now, you would never think, we would never be in a situation where folk would have to charge to get tutored on maths. So why are we in a situation where you have to get charged for arts and culture? So we have to be shifting so that we're actually seeing it as essential. So I think education budgets are a way that we can do that, and an outcome for culture as well, specifically through all government departments.
Fiona, I think the people of Stirling and Moray may have a disagreement with you about cuts into culture budgets. In terms of democratic accountability of trust is very important, and yes, it's something that we do have to see. But the other thing about trusts is that they have been moved from purely public sector into a third sector domain, which means wonderful, they can attract more money to their core service and what they're developing, but that is at the cost to all the other third sector arts organisations that are left competing against large trusts in that setting, and it disadvantages the practitioner. The individual practitioner seeking funding to develop their own practice will lose out because of it.
That's an issue for local council. It's not government policy. We're not promoting the trust, and the government policy haven't. I agree with the points you make.
Yep. Okay, and I think the spirit of all of this is, I hope the panel are also listening to the ideas, the concerns and the propositions that are coming from the floor. We are very tight for time now. I want to take one last question, and I want each of the panel to answer it very, very briefly, but can I also ask them to then give us one reason why this audience should vote for their party next week in terms of their support for arts and culture. And the question is moving us from the local to the international. Peter?
My name is Peter van der Werf. I'm a Dutch artist, and I work and live in Argyll and Bute, one of the councils hit by cuts. We haven't got an arts officer there. I run an arts and design studio. I'm a textile artist, and I work with wool, sheep's wool. It's everywhere, so that's why I'm there. And I'm also involved with inspiring young artists across Argyll and through various charities. But this is possibly because I'm Dutch. I've got my concerns about, say, it's not an election, but it's a referendum. Here it comes. Europe. What and how would we encourage and foster closer links with Europe? And the reason for asking this is my concern that in case of a Brexit, and it is still possible, I fear that Scotland will lose its relevance. Simple as that. Just that.
And seeing it's about Brexit, I'm going to ask Iain.
Conservative Party, we're allowed to form our own view on. Brexit. I have formed mine. You talk about relationship with Europe. Europe's not the EU. They're very different things. Europe is twice as many countries as are members of the European Union. We give European Union £350 million a week in this country. We get about half of it back. They tell us how to spend it. I think that's investment that we'd be much better retaining here in Scotland. I think I'm entirely comfortable with the idea of a Brexit and entirely comfortable with a relationship with Europe, including the countries in the EU and the countries out with it going forwards. And my top line, I'm going to let Terry pick my top line. So Terry's doing caricatures and cartoons of us as we've been going on. He's been tweeting them out. They've been getting tweeted at. So Terry's top line is a cartoon of me here. And Creative Scotland lacks clarity of purpose, and we seek to challenge the government.
Thank you.
On the issue of the
upcoming EU referendum, I'm very firmly a supporter of the In campaign, and think that here in Scotland we need to have a positive campaign around the reasons for staying within the European Union, and I think artists and everyone has an important role to play in convincing the Scottish electorate and the UK electorate that that would be the right thing for Scotland. I think for the UK to leave the EU wouldn't be good for our economy, our cultural life or our society, so I'll be very firmly campaigning in favour of an in vote. In terms of a final pitch around the culture sector, we have today said that we'll protect the arts budgets at national level in real terms, as well as investment to local authorities. And while Fiona is correct to say it's not all about the money, which I think is a Jessie J song somewhere, it's not all about the money, it is bloody important when it comes to supporting the culture and the arts sector. And we are given that commitment today. And we also think that if we're faced with a choice between austerity and the cuts that we know are coming over the next 5 years of the Parliament, we should be bold and use the powers that are coming to the Parliament to invest in our culture and in our people and into our society. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Peter. As a Liberal Democrat, it will come as no surprise to you whatsoever that we're strongly in favour of staying inside Europe. We value the very strong cultural links that has been developed, especially over the past 70 years, and we value the freedom of movement, and we don't want to see any form of exit, because that will lead to uncertainty. In fact, I regard this whole debate as a schism among the right wing of the UK political system, and I think that most of us... I do, actually, because the whole debate has been driven by UKIP was a schism of the Conservative Party, and there you go. It's a debate on the Conservative wing, really. Anyway, sure. I am. Back to the question is that why you should vote Liberal Democrat. I'm glad that Zara spoke about the value of education. That's where we want to focus our raise on taxation in order to get education back, instead of having special bursaries for this, or making sure that arts education is especially provided for. Let's provide for whole of education. Let's get our children and our lifelong education services back up to world standards.
So there's loads of problems with the EU and we're all aware of them, but Scottish Greens take a position that we are pushing to stay in the EU, but we want to see reform and we want to see progressive reform, and we need to have a seat at the table in order to change that. I think the European Union is a very strong and diverse group of nations, and when you have diverse voices coming together, you make better decisions and you have a more culturally vibrant society. We are wanting to push to actually maintain and strengthen that richness of Europe that has made all of us who we are today. Our young people we're one of the first generations after the war to actually experience genuine European integration and to know what it's like to have free borders and free movement of people. I do not want to be the last generation in the UK and in Scotland to experience that kind of integration, because it is powerful and it is particularly pertinent to the type of divisive societies and challenges that we have facing our society at the moment. In terms, if you look at America and the Donald Trumps of the world, we do not need views like his. We want to see and celebrate diversity. So I think the key, in answer to your question about how do we foster European relations and integration, I think it lies with our young people, and I think that we need to invest in youth programmes that bring young people from across Europe together and invest in cultural exchanges. We have this in the form of Erasmus, but unfortunately in the UK it has been seriously downplayed, and we have not had our governments push it enough to our young people, and it's not been accessible enough to a wider range of young people. So I think that's key in terms of fostering future and positive relations and creating the different kind of Europe that, again, we all know is possible. In terms of why I think that you should vote for the Scottish Green Party in this election, we are not going to be the party in government. We are well aware of that. It is likely, if the polls are true, to be the SNP again, and it will be a majority government. Now, we believe that Scotland can can be better, it can be fairer and more progressive, but to meet those challenges and to actually have that progressive Scotland, we need a bolder and diverse Holyrood with more green voices. And we want to be there as a constructive opposition to work with others who share our aims to achieve the aims that we all want to see. So I think you've got some choices in this election, particularly on how you use your list vote, and who do you want to be in there as that constructive opposition? Do you want it to be the Conservatives leading and pushing the SNP to the right, or do you want a strong and bold opposition that comes from the Scottish Green Party that's about a progressive and visionary idea of what Scotland can be that takes people with us? That is why I think you should vote Green.
I'm a nationalist because I'm an internationalist, and our SNP government has deliberately put culture, Europe and external affairs together as one brief, because we understand the importance of culture in connecting people, not just within this country, but internationally. And it is because of the SNP government that we've been invited by the governments of Italy and France and others to make sure we can exchange and share our cultural experience and our artists with other countries. I signed an agreement with the French Culture Minister as part of the SNP government. Now, if you want to have that kind of vision and that international to continue, remember we initiated the first ever global cultural summit, bringing ministers from all over the world here to Edinburgh during the summer period, bringing and exchanging ideas. That is leadership. That's not just leadership within Scotland, that's leadership internationally, and I don't want to lose that. I have sat and represented the UK on the Culture Council within Europe, and I'm respected, and the government is respected because of the experience we bring. And when I say to you, when you look at this election, it's a week tomorrow, we can play at deciding who wants to be opposition. But if you want to have that record, and if you look at the record on culture of this government since we first took office in 2007, compared to what went before, and what might happen if there isn't a majority SNP government, then that's the balance and that's the judgment you have to have. If you want to have an SNP government, if you've liked what we've done up until now, the only way to guarantee that you get that in a world of complacency, which is very worrying indeed, is to make sure and vote for an SNP government. And the best way to make sure we stay within the European Union is to make sure we've got strong voices arguing for it, and our party most certainly will be one. But we have to make sure that in terms of where we want to go, it's about vision, it's about record, and it's about leadership. And if you want that in the cultural sector, that's what the SNP has to offer.
I think there was a very good question here about European integration, how we sort of share these cultural experiences. We've got a lot of family connections and family friends in Germany. I do remember as a kid being out there visiting these relatives, and we got there, and the family friends there, their kids had just gone back from school, you know, and we're like, oh, it's the guest from Scotland sort of thing. And the kids, two of them, quick as off the mark, are reciting Robert Burns poems. And I'm absolutely sort of like flabbergasted at this. You know, here's two German kids knowing perfectly pronunciation, perfectly back to words, back to forwards, knowing Robert Burns like the back of her hand. And I remember sort of marking like that's remarkable. It's incredible you know these. They were like, oh, surely you know your Goethe and your Schiller. You know, I mean, there is a sense in which, you know, if we want, you know, from Cumnock to Cairo, there is so much more that unites us than divides us. And art, I think, can transcend these boundaries. Art transcends language, art transcends cultures, art transcends so many of the barriers that people would artificially build up between us. And by sharing art and sharing culture from across the world, I think we can make real strides forward in breaking down barriers and building a truly multicultural, united society, both here and across Europe. In terms of why you should vote for Rise on 5th of May, and I think it follows on from that last point, it's a question of priorities. You know, if we wanted to be teaching Goethe in schools, we could. There's questions of priorities there, and I think if we want to make sure we have the priorities right, be clear on who you're voting for your opposition, who you want to have in that parliament. Because over the last couple of years, we've seen, you know, even in the last couple of weeks, months, we've seen Scottish Government U-turns on restoring the top rate of tax, U-turns on replacing the hated council tax, cuts to the college sector, cuts. Cuts, cuts. The point is, we've seen time and time again that the Scottish Government is far too susceptible, far too vulnerable to pressure from the right. I think it's time that we stood up for the priorities we believe in, to say that we should have a society based on the rights of the people and not the corporate greed of the big profits of big companies that would seek to drain our society of what it can offer. It's time to make sure there's real left pressure, left voices back in that Parliament to put pressure on from the left for a change. And if you want that left pressure, then I hope you'll help us change Scotland. I hope you'll stand up with us and say that Scotland can be so much better than this. And I hope on May the 5th you'll vote Rise. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Just a quick question. So, hands up if your voting intention before you arrived is going to change as a result of what you've heard tonight. Just out of interest. Couple maybe? Okay. That's interesting. One is my daughter. I'm going to find out later. Okay, I just want to thank Out of the Blue for hosting the event. It is a fantastic venue and an important part of Edinburgh's arts ecology. I want to thank Janie and Linda and the Scottish Artists Union. I want to say a wee bit that the membership of Scottish Artists Union, I believe, is increasing all the time. And I think that's indicative, I think, of an organisation that's, that's touching on the zeitgeist a bit. You know, artists who want to engage in a debate and discussion about their own conditions, their own future, their own situation. So I think it's terrific to hear that the Scottish Artists Union is growing, and more power to their elbow. I want to thank you as an audience for coming along, for engaging with us. I think it's really important that there is a conversation to be had between the people who seek to run the country and the people who vote them in there, whether it's about arts or any other subject matter. I think we saw through the referendum a couple of years a kind of mobilisation of interest in their political lives. I hope that can continue. I hope we don't revert to a degree of apathy and indifference to what happens. So please engage in the process, and this has been an important part of it. And finally, can I thank all the panellists? It's a tough job, and they've conducted themselves with good grace, and I think informed us very honestly about their positions. Can I have a big round of applause for the panel? Thank you.